Before I begin in describing the direct human health impacts, I need to invoke the metaphor from a famous movie that some of you will be familiar with called The Graduate. Dustin Hoffman is pulled aside at one of the celebration events for his college graduation, and he is told, I forget the name of the gentleman who tells him this, um, uh, plastics, one word, plastics is, the future is plastics, essentially. And while at the time it seemed very thoughtful and logical, and we understood much less about the health effects of plastics today, it's fair to say that plastics are not quite the future anymore, if not the past, and that will really be the resonant theme through this presentation. And you can tell already that one of the reasons why we've come to recognize plastics is probably the past is that science has evolved to help us understand the health effects on multiple levels of plastics and their use in a widespread basis on our planet. So to provide you some statistics, you can read them on the screen, but I'll just add, as we've gone into a very heavily consumer and fast-paced age, there really are only three slowdowns in the exponential growth of plastic production on our planet: the 1970s oil crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, and the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. And even despite those pauses in plastic production, we have continuously produced 2 million tons beginning in the 1950s and are all the way well over 400 million now each year, with growing demand from emerging economies, suggesting that no place on our planet is free from plastics. Now, the widespread use of plastic is a product of convenience in part. A byproduct of the use of plastics is that they're convenient byproducts of fossil fuels. On the right, you can see a chemical diagram that provides some of the workflow by which the raw materials for plastics are made. I'm not trying to turn anyone on this call into a chemist, even though as an undergraduate degree, I did study chemistry. So it's something that appeals to me. But leaving aside the oddities of my interests before coming into a career in medicine, it's fair to say that crude oil is the basis from which we get ethane. We refine it and crack it to make ethylene, and we polymerize ethylene to what we use commonly in many products, polyethylene. And natural gas provides propane, which we refine and crack into propylene, and then make polypropylene plastics from that monomer. And vinyl chloride, which is used in polyvinyl chloride, softer, crinkly wrap, is made from ethylene by adding chlorine gas to make vinyl chloride, and then that's polymerized to make polyvinyl chloride. So generally, all of the crude materials that are used to make plastics come from fossil fuels. And you can imagine as Brazil, Russia, India, China, and other industrializing countries are increasingly making fossil fuels, and the pressure is on to combat climate change. Some of these multinational companies are pivoting even more strongly from making fossil fuels, from oil and gas, into plastic as a way to sustain economic growth. So suffice it to say, there are some converging social and economic forces that are driving the growing use of plastic on our planet. When you boil down the three core problems from a human health perspective, they really boil down into the three I've listed here. There are ecosystem effects from plastic that you've no doubt seen. We've literally put the planet in a plastic wrap or bag, as you can see pictured on the right. There are climate change effects, and then we'll focus the majority of the presentation on chemicals, microplastics, and their impacts on human health. Many of you have likely seen pictures like the one on the right. We have a major trash problem with plastic. Plastic waste is in the millions of tons annually. Recycling has been described by the California Attorney General Rob Bonta as a lie. Leaving aside the support for those claims, it's fair to say that only 9% of all plastic used to date has ever been recycled, and that leaves one of three fates for plastic in our environment. It goes into landfills, it is burned or exported elsewhere. And burning is particularly problematic, as we'll talk about later, but because it creates dioxins, which are extremely potent carcinogens. And there are issues besides that with the broad and widespread growth of landfills across our planet that serve as a reservoir for the plastic that we use. It's important to also emphasize that communities where plastic manufacturing occurs suffer disproportionate impacts. This is a picture on the left of the state of Louisiana with a variety of toxic release inventory sites documented by the Environmental Protection Agency. These are reported uses of industrial chemicals, and they span a region generally along the Mississippi, where many low-income and diverse communities live and suffer disproportionate exposures, largely due to volatile organic chemicals that are emitted during the manufacturing process. It's not as though air emissions from these plants are extremely well controlled. Moving from the making of plastics to the end fate of plastics, the story of this sea turtle depicted on the left with a plastic straw struck on its nose really caught the human dimension of macroplastics. These are larger size visible plastics. We'll talk about micro and nanoplastics later. But it really made us recognize the broad scale impact that it could have on our own selves as humans. Not that we get plastic straws stuck in quite this graphic way. At a more microscopic level at the same time, there's a very large body of literature that has documented the microplastic effects on fish, from inflammation, changes in DNA expression, and damage to DNA, to a host of organ system effects, from brain to reproduction and even mortality that arise as a result of ingestion. And because we rely on fish for a substantial component of the food supply, we ultimately are indirect receivers of microplastic in what we might describe a One Health mode, where what we experience and what we do to our ecosystems reverberates into our own human exposure and existence when it comes to plastics. We have crossed multiple other planetary boundaries with respect to human health. This series of slides, which has been put together by the Stockholm Resilience Center, documents the multiple heat and other related boundaries that have been crossed continuously from 2009 to 15 to 2022. These 8 items, which have been tracked over that time period, represent, or rather 9, I apologize, represent the primal components that are perceived to be part of our ability to survive as a planet. As you can see, we keep exceeding those planetary boundaries. And in a more recent study that some of my colleagues have done, published last year, they've documented that of these components of planetary boundaries, plastics through multiple mechanisms, not all which would require an entire hour to go over the slide. Suffice it to say that plastics contribute to multiple aspects of disruption of our ability to survive as a planet, even leaving aside direct consequences for human health. We'll talk about climate change in a moment, but there are altered changes in our land and water resources, as well as ocean acidification, atmospheric changes, etc., that are directly related to the use and life cycle of plastics from production all the way to end use as waste. When it comes to climate change, there are direct and indirect effects of plastic on our climate. At the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories, colleagues have estimated that plastic production contributed 5% of global CO2 emissions. A substantial amount of it comes from polyethylene plastics, but also polyvinyl and other plastics are also directly responsible. And while I accept already that some of our best case scenarios have gone out the window when it comes to climate change, modeling suggests that if we do not reduce our production of plastic, we will not be able to even achieve some of the rosiest increases in temperature on our planet. We just can't simply sustain the global carbon budget, even with other increases in electric vehicle uses and other steps taken to reduce fossil fuel production and consumption directly. And in addition, we know that microplastics limit the planet's capacity to sequester carbon dioxide, adding to the consequences. So what little capacity the planet has left to absorb carbon dioxide is further limited by the presence of microplastics in the ocean. For the remainder of this presentation, though, I'm going to focus on the chemicals used in plastic materials. And with this explosion in the production of plastics have come a diverse array of chemical exposures, many of which we've not encountered before, and many of which we have little information on which to go when it comes to consequences for human health. This is a major report from last year, which documented that 16,325 chemicals are used in plastic materials. And you can see in that blue semicircle on the left, 10,000 of them, 2/3, have no hazard data. So no data to inform consequences for human health. So we literally don't know what is in our plastic. I'm not saying that all of those 10,000 chemicals are problematic, but even if you estimate 1% of those chemicals of concern to be a problem, you have another 107 to add to the list that we already know are hazardous. You can see on the right in red, 4,000 chemicals have been identified to be hazardous, and there are other chemicals for which there are some partial data suggesting health concerns. Now, the concerns described on the right run the gamut from direct consequences for fish and wildlife. Carcinogenicity is among the effects that have been described, and mutagenicity, that's the CMR on the right, 1,489 such chemicals have been identified as such. And then many of the chemicals, the POPs, or persistent organic pollutants, the 179 on the right, are registered as part of the Stockholm Convention, an international global treaty to reduce the use and production and transmission of persistent chemicals that are known to be toxic to human health and stay in the body for decades in some cases. Now, the emerging threat is in that 47 on the right in the EDC category. And EDC stands for endocrine disrupting chemicals. I'm going to focus the biggest part of the presentation on that category of chemicals. But to give you a sense of the endocrine system, I need to use a bit of a football metaphor. I'm not a huge football fan, but I like this metaphor. A UCLA football coach before Vince Lombardi used this quote later, described that the notion that winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. Now, we think of the endocrine system as just one system in the human body, but what I'm going to argue in this presentation is that the endocrine system isn't everything. It is the only thing, and that is because endocrine refers to hormone. Hormone are signaling molecules underlying basic biological functions to humankind, from temperature, metabolism, salt, sugar, and even sex. Practically every biological function in which you have to send a signal from one body part to another body part is run through the endocrine system. And so every biological function at some level requires an orchestral coordination between two or more different organs, and the endocrine system is crucial to that. So as we'll talk about, every biological function and every chronic disease you can imagine at some level, at a basic level, has a signaling mechanism underlying it between tissues. And that's why the endocrine system is so core. And the endocrine system is extremely vulnerable. And to give you context, the endocrine system runs on a series of low-level chemical signals. These are often chemical signals too, just like synthetic chemicals. These are just natural chemicals. And they run in normal functioning at levels that are proverbial grains of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. When you're talking about chemicals used in plastic materials, they're in similar concentrations. So in many cases, they're competing directly with receptors in the human body, and thereby disrupting the normal a symphony that you can imagine that is the human body and its biology, from cradle to grave and from womb to tomb. So the entire lifespan, even though I'm a pediatrician, I'm going to tell you that kids are uniquely vulnerable to the effects of these chemicals, and we'll explore that in this presentation. The fact is that life is a window of susceptibility to chemicals used in plastic, because they operate by disrupting this symphony that we require to be a epic performance from beginning to end. And plastics are a crucial source of these endocrine disrupting chemicals. I'm going to focus today on 5 categories of chemicals: bisphenols, used in polycarbonate plastics and aluminum can linings; phthalates, used in food packaging; per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are nonstick materials used in cooking, increasingly in plastics, but also in oil and water resistant clothing. And there are flame retardants. I've listed the brominated type, but there's a phosphorus-based set of compounds that are added often to plastics to prevent burning. You don't want your phone, your cell phone, to burn up in the middle of a meeting, for example. And these chemicals are often added with that purpose in mind. Now, we've already alluded to the notion that burning plastics also creates dioxins, which are very potent carcinogens. I won't talk too much more about that. I'm going to focus the remainder of the presentation on the various effects. I appreciate this is a cancer center audience. I'm going to talk arguably just a little bit about carcinogenicity, but the effects are also increasingly being understood of these chemicals to be contributing not just to the origin of cancers, but potentially to the progression of cancers, including the basis of some research studies being done by colleagues here at the NYU Langone Cancer Center. I want to emphasize this is an emerging science, but it's mainstream science. There are some in the chemical industry who will try to dispute the available science. We've had 2 scientific reports from the Endocrine Society, an organization of 16,000 scientists. The first report came out in 2009. It identified the consequences of these chemical exposures for our hormones from laboratory studies back then. It was followed up 6 years later by a second report in 2015. And that report had 1,331 scientific references. It takes a lot for a scientific society to write a second report 6 years after the first, but it speaks to the growth of science documenting the effect of chemicals, particularly those used in plastic, on our hormones in our bodies. Another report in 2012 came out from the World Health Organization, United Nations Environment Program, documenting endocrine disrupting chemicals as a global public health threat. And you can see, going from the left to the right, there's been growing attention from other scientific entities. So the International Federation of Gynecologists and Obstetricians has patient-facing guidance to reduce these exposures. My own American Academy of Pediatrics has put particular emphasis on chemicals intentionally and unintentionally added to foods. On the upper right, the World Obesity Federation talks about these chemicals and their contribution to obesity and diabetes independent of diet and physical activity. So nothing I'm here to say mitigates the importance of diet and physical activity in maintaining a healthy metabolism. But chemicals are a proverbial third leg to that stool. And most recently, the National Academy of Science in that medium blue in the middle has documented that it's time for healthcare providers to actually test people for nonstick chemicals based upon the degree of water contamination, which is widespread in the United States. Over 100 million Americans live with enough PFAS in their water to contribute to chronic disease. Now, I'm going to start by talking, as a pediatrician, I'm a bit biased. I'm going to talk about brains first in little babies, but it's important to talk about this because this is where we first found out about chemicals used in plastic and their effects on our health. Plastic chemicals, phthalates in particular, the additives used to soften crinkly food packaging and such, as well as cosmetics, literally shrink babies' brains. And that shrinkage in babies' brains explains the relationship with IQ tests performed at 14 years of age. So this diagram that has a bunch of statistics that don't really matter for this discussion shows a triangle that graphically describes the connect the dots that researchers have done. What they did was measured from a Dutch study, phthalate levels in pregnant women, followed the children out to age 14, did neuropsychological testing, and a couple years earlier, they had actually imaged the brains of these kids. And when they looked at the relationship at the bottom between phthalate exposure and IQ tests, they found this negative association. So that was step one. Then they went back to the magnetic resonance images of these kids' brains, and they literally saw that the relationship with phthalate exposure with the reduction in total gray matter explained a substantial part of the association going from up to down on that triangle to IQ. So literally you have two things going on here. One is you have a consistency of evidence across the way that the effect is measured, and you have those two measurements reinforcing the model that explains how the effect occurs in the first place. So this is a very important study because it shows a robust connect the dots, which explains and gets us closer to what we might call causality, which puts us at a place where we really need to act. We don't have randomized controlled trials for these exposures because ethically, you can't intentionally dose somebody with a chemical that might be toxic, and reducing exposure because of the ubiquity of plastics in our environment is more difficult to execute in practice. When my colleague, Dr. Gasabian, who did that study, looked further, she also found that thyroid hormone was substantially reduced by these phthalates. Those are all the negative numbers on the yellow. The numbers seem very small, but it's important to emphasize the effects on thyroid hormone because it's another part of the connect the dots picture that explains how these chemicals contribute to disease and disability. Thyroid is a master signaler of brain development during pregnancy. Baby relies on mom thyroid hormone through the second trimester. And even in the clinically normal range, subtle shifts in the wrong direction can explain not just cognitive deficits, but even autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So these chemicals used in plastic materials likely contributed to this shrinkage of the brains in these little children who then came on to be adolescents who were not as well able to perform in school because of the functioning of the thyroid hormone system during pregnancy. We also know that babies get born earlier due to these chemicals. And what's disturbing about this study that I'm about to describe is that we measured not just phthalates that were originally used in plastic materials. There's been a lot of attention to phthalate-free materials. You've probably seen in the news. What this study also describes is the association with preterm birth was stronger with the replacement chemicals that the industry was using when they realized that di-2-ethyl hexylphthalate, or DEHP, the chemical that was being used in a lot of vinyl chloride plastics, was a concern in the first place. And when you add up the statistics, it suggests that in the range of 5% of premature births or even more are attributable to phthalate exposure. With social costs, premature birth requires hospitalization, for example. Kids are less well able to perform in school as a result of being born early, of $4 billion a year. We also know that these chemicals, through multiple mechanisms, from brain to disruption of gut function to, again, thyroid hormone, which is important for maintaining a healthy metabolism, can also contribute to obesity and diabetes. This series of meta-analyses really brings the literature home and reinforces the fact that these chemicals have been reviewed by multiple cohorts, finding associations that are quite strong, whether it's for type 2 diabetes in adults or GDM, or gestational diabetes, in pregnant women. Before I go on to the next slide, it's important to emphasize that we've even identified some mechanisms by which these chemicals contribute to obesity and diabetes. An intervention study in which they successfully got adults to lose weight through healthy diet and physical activity measured the serum PFAS levels after losing that weight. And they found that the PFAS levels were directly related to gaining that weight back. And then when they looked deeper, they found the resting metabolic rate was lower. So imagine your body's thermostat being turned the wrong way. And that's what these PFASs were doing to explain obesity in that case, or gaining weight back after a healthy diet and physical activity intervention. And that's one of the mechanisms that's thought to also be involved in contributing to diabetes. There are others, and this slide depicts a broader array of synthetic chemicals used in plastics and their effects, including, again, the dioxins I talked about earlier. We know that chemicals used in plastic materials also disrupt reproductive function. Among the best described chemicals known to be impactful to male reproductive development are, again, the phthalates. What phthalates seem to do is to reduce an anatomical distance called anogenital distance. Now, I'll explain what anogenital distance is in a moment, but the anogenital distance with which a baby is born is the anogenital distance you generally have as an adult compared to your peers. And it represents a balance of male sex hormone vis-a-vis female sex hormone. And except for a brief period called mini-puberty in infancy, the AGD that you're born with is the one that you'll have as an adult. And shorter AGD represents a relative lower testosterone exposure in utero. And particularly in boys, that shortened anogenital distance in adulthood is associated with reduced semen quality, testosterone level, as well as cardiovascular risks. And multiple studies have indeed associated phthalate exposure in pregnancy with the reduction, not in the adult anogenital distance, mind you, that takes a 25-year study to conduct. Those kinds of studies are ongoing, but with infant anogenital distance, which is this very strong predictor of adult anogenital distance. So these are key pieces in the puzzle that tell us that phthalates and other chemicals used in plastic disrupt reproductive function, particularly in males, but we also know, for example, that bisphenol A is directly toxic to ovarian function. And in adults coming to fertility clinics, multiple studies have identified reductions in semen quality. This is in the context of current adult exposure with phthalates, bisphenols, as well as PFAS. It's important to also emphasize that we know that there are serious cancer risks, particularly best described for polyvinyl chloride plastics. Now, this slide focuses on cancer risks in communities around the plants themselves, but there are also a series of case control and small-scale cohort studies that have identified phthalates and bisphenols, for example, to be associated um, with uh, breast cancer risk, as well as thyroid cancer risk. The studies are small, and they need to be verified further. We also there's some suggestive studies linking these chemicals to prostate cancer. These need to be corroborated with larger size cohorts. They're based largely on populations that have come to cancer clinics with a new diagnosis of prostate cancer, for example, or other endocrine cancers, and have matched exposures, matched patients to control patients without cancer to try to see what the differences are in exposure. But suffice it to say, there is strongly suggestive evidence as well that these chemicals contribute to cancer risks. And indeed, among the better described effects of these plastic related chemicals are PFAS. Now, what's depicted here that's important is that some have argued that the literature is not really that clear with the effects. This is a meta-analysis, which is an integration of multiple cohort studies. It doesn't show a net effect across all the studies, but when you split the studies by measuring the chemicals after diagnosis, which may be biased by other factors that may have occurred after the patient's already developed breast cancer, to pre-diagnostic samples, in which case the exposure that's documented precedes the incidence of disease, you actually see in those pre-diagnostic studies a suggestive and near significant association with the incidence of breast cancer. Still needs to be verified for further studies. It doesn't meet what you might call the conventional statistically significant thresholds, but it speaks to the need to really dig in and identify which studies are the most important in contributing to our understanding of the origins of certain reproductive cancers. Now, I haven't mentioned a single time in this conversation human studies documenting the effects of microplastics, and you might wonder why. And the fact is that we've had analytical chemistry techniques to measure chemicals used in plastic materials for about 50 years. The technology to measure microplastics in humans is much more emerging. The study that I'm presenting here, in which we found that kids' levels of microplastics in feces were higher than those found in adults, is only about 4 years old at this point. That was one of the leading edge studies identifying microplastics being excreted through the guts of adults as well as kids, polyethylene and polycarbonate plastics. We've detected since then an increasing array of tissues. This is a study showing microplastics in placenta. It may be that they're diffusing around cells that are normally intended to filter the blood from mother to baby. But also these could be coming in through other pathways and not just by sneaking around cells to get in. There are multiple pathways by which these microplastics get in. Now, the study that has really galvanized the concern about microplastics in human health is this study on the right from the New England Journal of Medicine that found microplastics in the carotid arteries of adults to be related to risk of heart attack, stroke, and even death. A fourfold increase, a very serious concern. But I have to say that even this study was in its earliest days, because there's still controversies in the field about measurements, if they occur in one lab or as opposed to another lab, what the meaning of those different lab measurements are. The chemicals on the linings of individual microplastics and nanoplastics may differ, and it may be that not every microplastic is alike. It may not be what the microplastic comes from. I mean, mind you, just to be clear, microplastics and nanoplastics are different length fragments of this same polymer that you think of as the plastic container that you run around with to carry water or food. Microplastics and nanoplastics are just different sizes of that polymer, let's say down to 1,000 molecules all in the same repeated chain. or 100,000. But we have a long way to go to understand what is going on. Is it the molecule that is making this polymer that's the problem, or is it the debris that these particles pick up along the way in the human body, or is it the size? Is it that these microplastics are literally banging their way through tissues, causing mechanical damage? The jury is still out. What we do know about cardiovascular risks is that phthalates themselves have been associated with cardiovascular mortality already. So it's not as though we didn't know that plastics contribute to heart disease. We already had talked about the fact that plastics contribute to obesity and diabetes. It's just that we now know of independent effects of phthalates to cardiovascular disease. It's been estimated that 50,000 adults in the United States die each year as a result of early heart disease due to plastic exposures, with $23 billion in lost economic productivity annually. And bisphenol A, a chemical we haven't talked about, those are typically used in polycarbonate or harder plastics, those proverbial Nalgene bottles you might have seen used over the years. It's associated with increases in thickness of that carotid artery, suggesting potential risk for clogging, as well as coronary artery disease severity, reductions in heart rate variability, which is a signal of early heart disease, not to mention all-cause cardiovascular mortality. So we need to know much more, and I'm not going to tell you that the science is definitive in every aspect of the effect of plastics in human health. But so many data points are telling us that there is harm, and we need to act to prevent exposure. And I want to emphasize, adapting from Ted Lasso, that while we see microplastics and nanoplastics, we need to be as curious about the invisible chemicals used in plastics as the visible ones. We know so much more already to act based upon the invisible chemicals used in plastics. So, and the costs of these chemicals used in plastic materials from a disease burden perspective is huge. So we did a series of studies a couple of years ago, culminating in this paper, which documented first the percentage of disease that could be linked to certain chemicals used in plastic. And the fact is, much to my horror, is the more we looked, the more we realized that so many products we don't think are plastic are really plastic. Nail polish is plastic. Paint is plastic. The linings of nonstick cooking pans are plastic. Any polymer that you use conventionally today is a plastic material. And when you add up just a conservatively based, best available science documenting diseases related to bisphenols, phthalates, flame retardants, and PFAS, the chemicals I talked about earlier in the presentation, the disease burden is $249 billion a year. And that's just the plastic specific part. So, and that's based upon a limited subset of the chemicals we know to be problematic. And there are these 10,000 chemicals we don't know about, a subset of diseases due to the few chemicals we studied, and a subset of costs due to the few diseases due to the few chemicals we studied. And so this is a really extreme underestimate, and yet it's such a big problem. We also know that there are disparities in exposure that may be driven by factors in the social and economic environment, in the dietary access that some populations have. And we know that, for example, that non-Hispanic, Blacks, and Mexican Americans bear a disproportionate burden of the disease burden due to chemicals used in plastics. And when you go to lower and middle income countries, the reality is that there are many places where you can see pictures like that described on the right. And this happens in the United States too. There are waste pickers here in the USA. Waste picking magnifies plastic contact. And many of the waste pickers are women of childbearing age who comprise a substantial proportion, and potentially that adds to a multi-generational downstream consequence of plastic production and consumption. And this is going to be a growing problem, particularly in those low and middle income countries where chemical production and consumption will be majority low and middle income countries by 2030. And we already know, based on some limited data, that chemical exposures to some phthalates, as you can see on that right column, are actually higher in Latin America, based upon modeling we've done, than in the USA, based on national survey data. It's just that we don't typically measure them in some of these contexts where the exposure may be higher. We assume that the exposure is non-existent because we assume the history of plastic use is not that long-standing. So I've horrified you, I've probably scared you in this presentation. I'm going to close by talking about safe and simple steps that we can take to limit these exposures, and talking about some hope I have in policies to reduce exposures. First of all, we know that bisphenol and phthalate exposures are preventable. This is a dietary intervention that used fresh and unpackaged food and substituted it in for the packaged food people were using. And these were reductions in these levels that occurred in days. So insofar as these interventions can be sustained in the short, medium, and long term, in the short term, you'll see chemical exposure levels in urine go down. In the medium term, you'll see hormonal levels improve. And then chronic disease risks in the months that follow reduce. So again, there are short, medium, and long-term benefits of taking these steps now, whether or not you've had chronic disease in the past. And in low-income communities, another intervention, just reading the labels on personal care products, produced a similar decrease in phthalate levels in a teen population of Latina girls. And the household environment's important too. Dust carries a lot of these chemicals of concern because plastic is used in an indoor environment. It's not as readily ventilated, and these chemicals deposit on surfaces. This is a study done leveraging a natural experiment, which certain common areas in a university underwent either no intervention, a healthy material intervention, or partial intervention, and the degree of intensivity of substitution with healthier materials produced greater reductions in PFAS levels, as well as organophosphorus esters. Those are flame retardants, and the PBDEs, or polybrominated diphenyl ethers. Those are also flame retardants. So where does that leave us in terms of what we can do? So just about that study, you don't need to gut renovate your home to produce reductions in chemical exposures and dust. Vacuuming with a HEPA filter or mopping with a wet mop can prevent dust from accumulating. It's also known that increasing ventilation rates inside the household can not only reduce the transmission of viruses, but can reduce levels of PFAS that are detectable in dust. Moving to food, that's really the source where there's the biggest bang for the proverbial buck. Canned food consumption, for example, is a straightforward way to increase your bisphenol consumption. Bisphenol exposures don't discriminate by the type of can. Acidity may be a driver, but all types of canned foods have detectable levels of BPA. Particularly, one thing I ask folks not to do, which is really simple, is don't microwave or machine dishwasher plastic. You're literally inviting the plastic to break down either into absorbing chemicals that are not intentionally added and not covalently bound to the plastic materials, or breaking them down into micro and nanoplastics that literally invisibly absorb into food. We also know that looking at the recycling number matters because there's certain plastics that are more problematic than others. 3 is for polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, that contain those phthalates I've talked about. 6 is for polystyrene, or styrene is a known carcinogen. And 7 includes polycarbonate, which includes some of the bisphenols that we talked about. If a plastic bottle is etched or scratched, it's really time to throw it away in particular. And I do suggest using stainless steel or cast iron cookware in lieu of nonstick cooking materials. I'm going to close in the few minutes I have left just to talk about some policy hope and change. And that's because there's a global plastics treaty that's being negotiated right now by the United Nations. And that's putting into relief, into deep focus, a debate that we've had about reducing versus reusing or recycling. Recycled plastic not only isn't real in practice, I alluded to the 9% rate of recycling on our planet, But recycled plastics can carry the chemical accumulation from previous uses. So, for example, polyethylene plastic has no right to have phthalates or bisphenols in it. Bisphenols and phthalates aren't additives to polyethylene plastic, but they've been found in recycled plastic bottles compared to newly produced bottles due to cross contamination. They've also been found to have metals that may have other problems that we haven't talked about. And recycling itself is energy intensive and more expensive than creating plastic from fossil fuels. Bioplastics, you may have heard about, like PLA, polylactic acid, have been touted as a plant-friendly alternative, but they also require higher temperature to be recycled, and they produce methane, which is more potent than carbon dioxide, driving climate change. We know that bioplastics also produce greater oxidative stress and anti-androgenicity. So we have to, the bottom line here is not to depress you and suggest there are no solutions, but we have to test our solutions to make sure they actually work to achieve their intended purpose. I'm going to, before I thank you and open to questions, just want to elaborate a little bit on the current state of the UN treaty process. The UN treaty process is looking at plastic production, chemicals used in plastic, putting infrastructure to protect low and middle income countries where the regulatory system may not be as strong, and set some common global rules and provide some guide rails and guideposts for industry to do the right thing to protect our planet and human health. This is a very ambitious process. It started in 2021 and 2 and the intention is to have a legally binding agreement. It's gone through 5 intense meetings. Treaty processes can be dynamic and hard to predict, but there's been substantial progress towards accomplishing the treaty goals. And that in turn will also feed into how we manage these exposures and how companies use plastic in the United States as well. So there are co-benefits insofar as the US shows leadership and countries negotiate a strong and legally binding plastics treaty. I'm happy to explore that more in the questions, but I really want to try to make sure that we get your feedback, and I hope this was helpful. Well, I want to be clear that it's not the color of the plastic that is the sole driver. It actually may be the major driver of chemicals used in plastic. It's just that the way the manufacturing process occurs is they've been able to more readily pool the black plastic because it comes largely from electronics and other sources, and they've been able to consolidate that. It's thought that the origin of that plastic for and the chemicals used to make that plastic in the first place, especially if it's electronics, may add flame retardants and other chemicals of concern more than others. But recycled plastics are well known to carry chemical contamination regardless of the color. The point that I want to make about getting folks to change their packaging is that it can be challenging to change your ways, but what we do need to do is better inform. And that's why these presentations are so valuable about the risks associated with using these trays and the ecological and human health impacts. And cost is often raised as the barrier, but I want to emphasize, and the system being rigged towards using plastic. I mean, after all, if you have to return a stainless steel tray or what have you, that may seem like extra work, but there was a time we did that. And there's a system that we can achieve to do that. The cost profile, in some cases, I've worked over the years advising a company that's developing stainless steel trays for use in public school systems. And they found that that's not been a huge barrier because there actually is a reduced cost in terms of reusing something that you buy multiple times insofar as it's managed. So the point that I'm making in terms of what can be done to get them to change packaging, which is one of the important questions being asked here, is to communicate what we know and explain the trade-offs and see how we can get folks to think a little bit outside the proverbial box. The easy thing to do, the way the system is set up right now and the way the economic incentives are, is to use plastic. So the answer is probably yes, they can cross the blood-brain barrier. There's a study out of New Mexico that I don't do this kind of research typically. It feels a little morbid to me, but they took people who had died and they collected samples from the medical examiner from different years, and they found growing increases in microplastic levels in relationship to the time that the patient died, and suggesting that there are there's an increase in plastic that's getting into the brains of these people. The answer is we don't know, but it's plausible. So there is, for example, aromatase is involved in certain cancer pathways, and it's actually stimulated by an herbicide called atrazine. Letrozole is a pharmaceutical that's designed by the same company that makes atrazine as a pharmaceutical to treat breast cancer. So likely the answer is yes, that plastics can impact the efficacy of cancer treatment options. Grassroots environmental education is a not-for-profit based in Long Island that has actually done some outreach with documents to support folks who are going through cancer care and guiding them about how to make their environment healthier. Again, the answer here is we don't know. Plastic bans come in various shapes and flavors. To my understanding of the current legislative action in New York, it's largely been limited to bags. And I want to be clear that bags and straws are scratching the surface of a deeper and broader problem. As much as there's been a lot of mayhem about plastic straws and bags, the fact is we need to design the food systems fundamentally so that they don't produce chemical exposures. It's everything from the tubing that's used to carry milk in the supply chain to how materials are packaged before they get on the shelves. So it's deeper and broader than that is really the bigger comment I can make. The next question is it safe to wash and then reuse plastic bags? Generally, I try to avoid it. Again, the reality here is you're not going to zero out spontaneously living in the New York metropolitan area your use of plastics when the system is designed to use them. There are, I think the main point here is to reduce food contact, especially, and reduce your own contact if possible with plastic. Again, food followed by dermal and inhalational absorption are really the major pathways for plastic absorption. I mean, it's not to say that if you look in our home, we don't have plastic. That's simply not true. So I think it's important to be realistic about what you can do in an environment that requires some fundamental system change. Apparel is a source of plastic for sure. And from an ecological standpoint, the impacts are large. The direct human health effects, the science is quite limited, to be perfectly honest. So it's still early days to answer the question about apparel and shoes. Wearing in the sun has the potential to be a little bit more of a straightforward pathway into the human body because heat tends to facilitate bleaching, just like plastic bottles in the proverbial hot spaces are more likely to absorb the chemicals used in those plastics. Plant-based plastics are in the bioplastics category. So I think we have to be really clear that natural doesn't mean safe. Again, we have to assess the safety based on what it is and what it does. Natural is not straightforwardly immediately safe. Corn is a biological product. It has biological properties. And those biological properties can have consequences when they're used in a way that's different, let's say, than food, using the example of GMO corn. It's better to use fewer plastic materials, fair to say, and better to use glass in the first place. So reducing contact and length of contact is important, and number of contact surfaces. For the recycling number, where to look for it on the bottle, it's a recycling triangle. It varies in its location, I'll acknowledge. It's getting smaller and smaller with time as packaging gets harder to read in some cases. So you have to really look around sometimes. So I want to be clear, in the New York metropolitan area, we have some of the best water, arguably, in the country. And each city or metro area, depending on where you are right now, has EPA required through the Safe Drinking Water Act documentation about the contamination or lack thereof in the water supply. If the water is safe to drink from the tap, you don't necessarily have to filter the water or get bottled water. Remember, bottled water adds plastic contact. And in some cases, bottled water comes from, you guessed it, tap water supplies. So while I understand the intention is good, the application and the times you should get bottled water really vary by where you are. If you were in Flint, Michigan during the lead contamination disaster, drinking bottled water was the right thing to do because lead levels were extremely high and it was contaminating kids' bodies in particular, but all people's bodies. So it's a very individualized answer. And really depends on the status and source of your water supply. Well water, for example, in certain rural parts of rural America has metal contamination that may make you switch to bottled water, or lead you to filter water, or use reverse osmosis if you have PFAS contamination in the water supply. It can be very expensive though. So all of these solutions have to be tailored, is really the bottom line.